It's Texas. It's Georgia. We got crossover episode talking about all the things you want to talk about for this upcoming match with an expert on Texas Longhorns next on Locked On Bulldogs.
You are Locked On Bulldogs, your daily podcast on the Georgia Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Crossover, Jonathan Davis from Locked On Longhorns, Daniel Monroe from Locked On Bulldogs. The game of the week. Forget about Alabama. Forget about Tennessee. It is Texas in Georgia, in Austin, in DKR. And Daniel, I think going into this game, especially in the offseason, things are a lot different than most people pictured it. A lot of people expected that the Texas Longhorns on October 19th would be trying to knock off the number one Georgia Bulldogs. But now the script is flipped, right? The Georgia Bulldogs are trying to knock off the number one Texas Longhorns at home. So, Daniel, I'm going to ask you, what gives you confidence? I know Georgia's been the class of college football the last couple of years, but what gives you confidence that Georgia can come into DKR and knock off the number one team in the country, the best team in the country, the Texas Longhorns?
Yeah, you mentioned things are different than we thought it would be, and initially I was like, well, no, they're not. We got two top 5 teams. Like, we knew this was going to be an epic matchup, but yeah, the roles are a little bit reversed. I think a lot of people might have thought, yeah, Texas might be 2, 3, 4, ranked, and Georgia might be number 1 coming into that game. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what gives me confidence, listen, I think Georgia is getting better every week. And I think while this Georgia team is not the dominant 2021, 2022 University of Georgia football team that we've kind of gotten used to, they're still a very talented football team. This Georgia team is littered with really talented players. I like the Georgia coaching staff. I like a lot of the things in terms of the matchups in this game against Texas. I picked Georgia to beat Texas in the preseason. I picked us to lose to Alabama, by the way, and I picked us to beat Texas in this game. And yeah, I think I still probably feel that way. But I mean, coming into this game, to me, this is a coin flip type game. I'd be curious to know if you feel differently, but this is truly like it reminds me a lot of that Ohio State-Oregon game we saw last weekend. I'm not sure it's going to come down to the final play like that or be such a wild finish like that. I would, it'd be great for college football if it did, but that's the kind of feel of it. It's at Texas, but I think these teams are pretty evenly matched. And yeah, I think it's just going to come down to who makes the plays, who plays with, the most composure, and who's able to maybe make 1 or 2 plays in the fourth quarter, because I expect this game to be tight going in, like coming down the stretch.
Yeah, I think so too. I said on the SEC squad show, like, I think this game is going to be 65, 70 points, kind of similar to what we saw in, the Alabama and Georgia game a couple of weeks ago. I think, both offenses are going to put on a show. When you look at, the Texas defense, I said it, they haven't faced a top 70 offense yet. And so Georgia and Carson Beck are certainly going to be the biggest test that they faced thus far. Both teams evenly matched. Both teams are legitimate championship and SEC championship contenders. So yeah, I think, when you look at this matchup, it's going to be, tough on both sides, 2 of the best teams in the country. And I really think it's going to go down to the wire. I think it's going to end up with one team with the ball at the end of the game. And if they win, will be determined by whether they score a touchdown or not on that drive. Kind of like Georgia at the end of the game against Alabama. You either score the touchdown and you go ahead for good, or you don't score the touchdown and the other team wins. So whether it's Texas with the ball at the end or whether it's Georgia with the ball at the end, I think the ability to put in that last touchdown, the team that has the ball last, will be able to win this gigantic matchup on October 19th between Texas and Georgia. I want to ask you, Daniel, because you talked about how this team may be more vulnerable than Georgia was in 2021 and 2022. And I was kind of thinking the same thing. There are still a lot of good players on this team, but I don't know if you have the high-end elite players that we're used to seeing, at least, in those 2 years when you won the championship. Like, who's the Brock Bowers? Who's the Ladd McConkey? Who's the Jalen Carter or the Jordan Davis? Do you think this team has the high-end talent Is that the biggest difference between the 2021 and 2022 squads and this one, that there's just not as much like obvious NFL talent on this team?
I don't think it's quite that, but I think you're on the right track. So there's a lot of NFL talent on this team, but Georgia does lack some. So far this year, Georgia has lacked some key difference makers in terms of college players that are able to completely impact a game. And I think, you can go to guys like Jordan Davis or Jalen Carter or all those, Devontae Wyatt, and go down the list of all those guys that were drafted off those two defenses, but really it's in the back end where you see the big difference. Like Georgia's solid at linebacker. Georgia's actually been pretty stout up front, even without they don't have a first round pick on that defensive front, but they've actually been pretty stout up front this year. Michael Williams, coming off the edge when he's healthy, is that type of elite first round talent. It's in the back end where this Georgia defense has gotten exposed this year. And it's guys like Kamari Lassiter. It's guys like Keely Ringo. It's guys like Javon Bullard. Like, those are the guys that Georgia has missed off those teams from years past that they haven't seemed to be able to replace. Obviously, they've got Malachi Starks, who's one of the best safeties in the country, but he's kind of been on his own this year at times. A lot of the play from the corners has been suspect. And that's really when Georgia's gotten exposed this year, which, I mean, we're talking about a Georgia team being exposed that is 5-1 with their only loss coming at Alabama at night by one score. So when Georgia has gotten exposed, it's been in the secondary on the back end, which kind of brings me, Jonathan, to like, is that how Texas, you imagine, is going to try to attack? Like Sark and Quinn and the game plan, are we going to try to go deep against this Georgia team? I know Texas is built for it. I know they've got the wideouts to do it. Is that how you imagine this Texas offense? We think both offenses are going to score, but is that how Texas is going to try to score in this game, by trying to take some shots and go over the top on this Georgia defense?
I think certainly, especially when you look at the way that Georgia plays defense, you feel like you got some favorable matchups on the outside just because, one, the corners haven't played well. I mean, you can expect that you're going to see a lot of man coverage, right? And so you want to be able to, take advantage of that with the Georgia Bulldogs. I think the two biggest questions in that regard for the Texas Longhorns are, we saw Isaiah Bond go out early in the Oklahoma game with a hamstring injury. He's been listed as day-to-day. How healthy will he be against the Georgia Bulldogs? Because he's probably your best deep threat. And then the other key to that is, what version of Quinn Ewers do we see, right? Because Quinn Ewers came back and probably played a C plus B minus game against Oklahoma. Of course, it was enough to, beat them 34-3, but he wasn't sharp, right? First couple of plays, missing wide open receivers, threw an interception, kind of getting sacked. And then they went to the short passing game, intermediate passing game, and he settled in, but he only threw for 199 yards in that game. So when you look at it, are we going to see the quarterback we saw against Michigan and earlier on in the season that was kind of throwing the ball, all over the field? Or is he going to struggle, right? Can Georgia get a pass rush on him, get bodies on him? I'm not sure how he's still feeling from that oblique injury. They get him moving around in the pocket a little bit. They speed him up. And then if, Quinn Ewers, because I believe this is going to come down to who plays better at the quarterback position, right? Same thing with Jalen Milroe and, Carson Beck, where Jalen Milroe was just a little bit better than Carson Beck in that game. If Quinn Ewers is not 100%, you know what I mean? If Quinn Ewers is not playing his best football, we just saw Carson Beck come off a game where he threw for 400 yards. So, if he's not playing his best football, I think this Georgia defense can get to him, rattle him a little bit. And we haven't seen Texas be able to run the ball at an elite level this year. So, I do think that we could be vulnerable at the quarterback position if we see the Quinn Ewers that we saw last week. So, definitely think Sark, wants to take advantage of that back end and try to go deep and try to get some explosive plays against that secondary. But like I said, it just all depends on what version of Quinn Ewers shows up in this game. Did look a little concerning last week against Oklahoma. And how healthy is your best deep threat in Isaiah Bond, in this matchup?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm sure we could talk more, when we come back from break, but yeah, I'm curious about that Texas run game. I'm curious about the way that these teams will try to attack each other. So I'll ask you about that when we come back.
For sure. And I want to talk about, Georgia's playmakers on offense. Like I said, you don't have a Lad McConkey or a Brock Bowers. Who should Texas be scared of in this game? We'll talk a little bit more about that after a quick word from the sponsors. All right, today's Locked On crossover between the Locked On Bulldogs and the Locked On Longhorns brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans and college football fans, of course, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. So that's FanDuel.com. Make sure you're placing your bets on your favorite team today. All right, bringing Daniel back in. We saw Carson Beck have his biggest game of the season in terms of yardage, 400 yards, last week. You kind of needed it, right? When you're allowing 30-plus points to Mississippi State and you're allowing a true freshman quarterback and Michael Van Buren to do what he did. Who on this Georgia offense do you think can step up and kind of take over in this matchup? Because we talked about the lack of high-end, just NFL talent that jumps off your screen, even at running back. You have, I think, Trevor Etienne, right? I always get them confused, Trevor and Travis, but he's not James Cook, right? There's no George Pickens on this team necessarily, right? No Brock Bowers, Lad McConkey, I'll say it again. So who on this offense needs to come along for the ride with Carson Beck to make sure Georgia wins this game on Saturday?
Yeah, it's funny, Jonathan, that the strength of this Georgia offense, and we've been saying it all year, is actually the surprising reason why this Georgia offense at times has struggled this year, like the first half against Alabama, because the strength of this Georgia offense and really what this entire Georgia offense is predicated on is the ability of Carson Beck to read and react to a defense. Like he is a longtime starter in the SEC. He's played a lot of football. He's played a lot of meaningful football. He's won a lot of football games. He's seen you could throw at him half or plus starting as the Georgia quarterback. But you forget that this guy's been on campus for backing up Stetson Bennett. He's seen everything in practice that, playing against this Georgia defense every single week. And so it's Carson Beck's ability to diagnose a defense and to react, which we think is Georgia's greatest strength on the offense. And it's also what's gotten Georgia into trouble because Carson Beck has made some bad decisions at times. He has thrown some ill-advised balls, and that's when Georgia has struggled. But when he's not turning it over, the strength of this Georgia offense is that there is no playmaker. There is no Brock Bowers. So there's no one to double team. And when you go 5 wide or you go 4 wide and then you run the back out of the backfield and you got 5 guys in the pattern, which Georgia does a lot this year. They have that, they are more spread out, I think, than I can ever remember seeing a Georgia offense being. When that's the case, you can't double everybody. You can't, you are finding those mismatches. You are finding those favorable matchups. And maybe it's a Dylan Bell. Maybe it's an Arian Smith. Last week we saw a young kid, Anthony Evans, who has been returning punts for Georgia, but he's getting on the field more as a wideout. I think we're going to see him a lot in this game. Texas fans, that's the guy, number 5 on the offense. When he comes in the game, you may want to send a text message to the coaching staff. He's going to get the ball. When he comes in the game, the ball is going to him. And he's a dynamic weapon when he's got the ball in his hands. Lawson Lucky, the guy that we thought was going to be the backup tight end coming into the year, has been really solid for this Georgia team. There's a lot of guys that can make plays. And the beauty of this Georgia offense is that when the offensive line pass protects, which they are very good at, when the offensive line pass protects and Carson Beck can sit back in the pocket, he's going to find the right guy and he's going to get him the ball on time. And so, no, there are no first-round talents at the skill positions for Georgia. None whatsoever. But they're doing just fine. like in terms of an offensive system. I think from my perspective, maybe you disagree. I would say similarly to Texas, where I don't know how much you think of Isaiah Bond, but I don't think he's AD Mitchell. Like, I don't think Isaiah Bond is AD Mitchell. And so I think in some ways Texas also downgraded maybe at the skill positions. But when you return a veteran quarterback and you have an experienced play caller and you've got an offensive system and an offensive line that's really solid, you don't really need first round pick. You don't need Jeremiah Smith like in order to move the football. It's nice to have him. You'd like to have him, but I don't think either of these teams maybe have the elite playmakers in terms of offensive skill talent, but that certainly doesn't slow down these offenses at all.
Yeah, I think, picking up on what you said, there's value in just being able to have a bunch of guys that you'd have to worry about instead of the guy, because I think a quarterback can sometimes over rely on that guy in certain moments, or a defense can take that guy away. And then now the quarterback is like, damn, I'm now, starting kind of my progressions with number 2 or number 3, or you spend too much time looking at number 1. And then that could lead to patting the ball, sacks, and, turnovers, trying to force it to somebody. When you look at it, Isaiah Bonds had games, over 100 yards, 2 touchdowns. The true freshman Ryan Wingo has had games going over 100 scrimmage yards. Matthew Golden, a 2-touchdown game. DeAndre Moore, a 2-touchdown game. Jonte Cook, a 2-touchdown game. So I think when you look at it, really in any one of these wide receivers could be the big play guy on Saturday against Georgia. And I think when you have to account for all of those guys at any time that they're on the field, that could be dangerous for a defense like Georgia, especially when you can look, with Steve Sarkisian and kind of identify the matchup that you want and be able to go to that guy at any point in the game. And then even when you look at tight end, Gunnar Helm, 98 yards against Michigan, 91 yards against Oklahoma. So in the 2 biggest games, our tight end has been our leading receiver. So it's just so much to account for on this Texas offense. And I think, similar to what you said, with Georgia, when you have to account for all of those guys and you can't key in on just one of them, I think that it, provides a different threat to the defense. I think, speaking of defense, a lot of people have talked about this Texas defense, and the question has been asked, are they elite really? Because statistically they are, or is it because they haven't played anybody, right? This defense has not faced a top 70 offense yet, right? The best offense statistically they faced this year was Mississippi State, who's ranked at 71. But one of the biggest things, and you talked about it earlier with Carson Beck, is Texas defense has done what elite defenses do, and they forced a turnover in all 6 games they've played this season. One of the biggest reasons they're number 1 in the country. Carson Beck, 6 turnovers in 6 games, even though I think all of those turnovers came in 2 games, but nonetheless, 6 turnovers in 6 games, right? So how do you see that playing out? This is one of those something has to give type of matchups. Do you think Carson Beck can play mistake-free football against a defense that has forced a turnover in every game they've played?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go back and look, just like with most stats, Jonathan, like what you find is that there's something to it. Like, there's something there, but there's also, like, on the second play from scrimmage against Mississippi State, Carson Beck threw a football that was deflected and bounced off an offensive lineman's helmet, went straight up in the air, and was intercepted. Like, there's no coach, there's no person who has ever watched football before that's going to look at that play and be like, Carson Beck threw an interception. Like, he gets credit for the interception, but it wasn't a mistake on his part. Like, it wasn't and so now the interception later in the game, whether the receiver broke there was a miscommunication clearly between quarterback and receiver, and he made an incredibly ill-advised throw. You go back to the Alabama game. One play Kirby directly mentioned in the press, one of the turnovers that Carson Beck had, receiver was supposed to come inside on a bubble screen, broke outside, and Carson Beck threw it straight to the defender that the receiver was supposed to break in front of. And some of them have not been his fault. Some of them have definitely been his fault. I do think it'll be the key for this Georgia football team, because Georgia has struggled to run the ball this year. And so, for better or for worse, the game is going to be put on Carson Beck's shoulders. I don't think there's a Georgia fan that in existence that doesn't know that to be true already going into this game. Like, whatever the score ends up being, I think it's going to be tight, which means even if it's a high scoring game, it's going to be on Carson Beck to keep pace and to not hold serve and to keep pushing. And if it's a low scoring game, it's going to be on Carson Beck to make a clutch play in a big moment in the right situation to get the job done and to not have a critical turnover in either scenario. So yeah, an opportunistic defense and a quarterback that has been turnover prone. But I think at this point, it's definitely my opinion. You'll find some different opinions among the Georgia fan base, but at some point, you got to just sit back and be like, all right, Carson Beck's played some bad quarters of football this year, but he still is who he is. He's still one of the best quarterbacks in the country. He's still thought of by most of the NFL draft guys as a first-round pick for a lot of good reasons. He's got a lot of tangibles. He's got a lot of intangibles. And I think that experience in Alabama, is going to be really positive for him moving forward throughout this year. He played. It wasn't all his fault. From an offensive standpoint, I mean, certainly he didn't allow 28 points to Alabama in the first quarter, so that wasn't his fault. But even from the offensive standpoint, like one of the worst quarters of football, one of the worst halves of football that Georgia has played in a long time, and then to do what he did in that second half against Alabama, which was basically to put the team on his back, to stand in under the face of extreme duress and throw, bombs down the field and bring Georgia back single-handedly, I think did a lot for his confidence. And so I think if you're Texas, you wish you had gotten him in that first big road night game, because I think he'll be a little bit more equipped to handle the second big road night game of probably 3 big road night games that he's going to have this year. When we come back, though, I want to turn the tables and ask you about this Texas defense. You mentioned them, the offenses that they've played, and get your read on who this Texas defense is. Are they elite? Are they pretty good? Are they kind of good? Do we not know who they are? That's my question about this Texas defense that's matching up against by far the best offense that they're going to play this year.
For sure. We'll definitely talk about this Texas defense. Been one of the best in the country thus far. But like I said, the biggest question is who have they played, and is that a result of who they've played? We'll discuss next. All right. Today's episode, this Locked On crossover between Locked On Longhorns and Locked On Bulldogs, is also brought to you by Game Time. Let me get that whatever it's called up on the screen. I forgot what it's called really quick. But today's Locked On crossover is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. If you're lucky, you might even find Texas and Georgia tickets on Game Time at this point, even though we know it's going to cost a pretty penny. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Some of the best features on the Game Time app. Why Game Time app is the best ticketing app in the industry. All-in pricing. Toggling this feature shows the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Seat views. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. The Game Time ticket coverage. Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. You're always complaining about ticket prices. Take $20 off your first purchase at Game Time. Terms apply again. Create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. All right, back for the last segment of the Locked On crossover. Jonathan Davis, Locked On Longhorns. Daniel Monroe, Locked On Bulldogs. Daniel wanted to ask about that Texas defense. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you mentioned it already. It's the narrative. It's, I'm sure it's upsetting to Texas fans to have to hear it over and over again. Georgia's done this in seasons past where it's been like, well, they hadn't played anybody. And, you look around and you're like, what do you want us to do? We're beating everybody by 100 points. Like we just they put a team in front of us and we blow them out, and we do it again and again and again every week. And so I'm sure Texas fans are sick of hearing it. And yet you look at you look at the two big wins on the schedule. The reason I think that Texas is ranked ahead of a team like Oregon right now, who just beat Ohio State, is because they've got these 2 wins. They beat Oklahoma last week, who was ranked at the time, and they beat Michigan in week 2, who was obviously ranked very highly at the time. I think we know a lot about those 2 programs, and I don't think I'm breaking any news when I say that those 2 offenses are abysmal. And particularly they are abysmal in terms of their ability to push the football down the field in the passing game, right? Like Oklahoma starting a freshman quarterback. I mean, I'm sure your fan base is loving the fact that they ran Dylan Gabriel out of town so that they could keep a guy that then they benched in week 3 because he wasn't good enough. Like the guy that might win the Heisman Trophy this year was on your campus and you pushed him out so that you could keep a guy. So just anyway,
Preach.
Oklahoma can't throw the football. We know that. Michigan, especially Michigan in week 2, with that guy that they were trotting out there at quarterback, had no prayer of throwing the football. And so you look at Texas's defense statistically, they are the best defense in the country at defending the pass. 126 passing yards per game, number 1 in America, which sounds good until you think about the fact that nobody's trying to even throw the football against Texas. Georgia, we've established, is going to throw the football. That's what we do. We can't run the ball. We need to throw it to set up the run. And so my question is not just, is Texas's defense good because they haven't played anybody? That's kind of the generic version of the question. My question is, particularly Texas has not played a dynamic passing offense. And so how do you imagine they're going to fare against an experienced quarterback and an offensive coordinator that's going to be trying to move the ball vertically down the field?
Yeah, I think that, this is well documented that this is the first big test for the Texas defense. And I think this is a great defense, even though they haven't played the competition. I think based on what we've seen, we can, still surmise that this is a pretty, really good, great, possibly even elite defense. But at times, great defenses struggle. And I think that's what we're going to see in this game. I watched a lot of Carson Beck this year, and you can see why, he's a highly touted NFL draft prospect, just calm in the pocket, ability to go through his progressions, make reads, and fire balls accurately on the money in between the numbers. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in this game, right? I think that there's going to be times where Carson Beck picks this defense apart. And I don't think it's going to be because Texas is a bad defense. I think it's just going to be because Carson Beck is a really good, seasoned veteran quarterback. And so I do think that, Georgia will score 30-plus points in this game. Like I said, I think it's going to be a shootout. And I think that the Texas defense is going to have to continue to be opportunistic, right? Because if Alabama doesn't get all those turnovers, Georgia probably wins that game. Right, especially the way that they stormed back in the end. And so I don't think that Texas is just going to shut down Georgia and force a bunch of 3-and-outs. I think they're going to have to get a key turnover, get Quinn Ewers one more possession on offense, and that's going to lead to the Texas Longhorns getting a victory in this game. So I think the Texas defense has been great based on who they played. I think they're going to give up some points. They're going to give up some yards to Carson Beck, but they're going to have to get a turnover or 2 for the 7th straight game to get a victory against the Georgia Bulldogs. Speaking of victory, we're about that time. We're at the end of the episode. Daniel, tell me what Georgia needs to do to win this game. And I know you think they'll win. So why do they win and what's the score?
I mean, look, when I say I think they'll win, I can't emphasize the word think enough in that scenario. The level of confidence. I've gotten on so many crossover episodes over the last 3 years, and just like an idiot ran my mouth and talked about how Georgia was going to blow. And most of the time we did. So it's worked out fine for me.
Every game but Alabama, y'all done it, right?
That's right. I don't feel that way about this year's Georgia team. I think this is a deeply flawed team. But I don't think there are very many teams in the country that we don't know for a fact are deeply flawed. Texas is one of the few teams in the country that we still don't really know if Texas is a flawed football, if they are truly in a class maybe on their own, or if they are kind of right down there in the mix with a bunch of other teams that are pretty good, but not necessarily, dominant football teams. I'm not sure we have a dominant football team in college football this year. So I think Georgia's going to get this win. Like I said, I predicted Georgia was going to get this win. I'll stand by that. I think the key thing that Georgia has to do in order to do that is to make Texas one-dimensional on offense, and then to try to affect Quinn Ewers without letting him escape the pocket, which is all easier said than done, right? Like, but you mentioned a lot of man coverage that Georgia you can expect to see when you play against Georgia, and that's because Kirby Smart has a well-documented defensive philosophy, which is that if you can't run the football, you won't be able to beat us. Like, you'll take your shots, and we'll give you some obvious passing situations, and we'll give you one-on-one matchups on the outside. But if you can't run the football against us, you're not going to be able to beat us over 4 quarters, because we're not going to, you may hit one, you may hit two, but we're going to keep coming, and you're not going to be able to withstand. And so I don't think you're going to see a shift in philosophy, as much as I think some Georgia fans, and even Clint and I this week, have talked about, does Georgia just drop back in 2 high safeties and try to take away everything over the top because of the struggles? I don't think you're going to see that. I think you're going to see Georgia commit to the run, be stout at the line, try to be stout at the line of scrimmage, and put those DBs on islands, and trust that they can get home with a pass rush. I think the health of Michael Williams is insanely important in this game. He played about 8 snaps against 2 weeks ago, and then last week against Mississippi State he played about 12 snaps. Kirby says he's getting better, but he is by far Georgia's best pass rusher and most effective difference maker on that defensive front. They're going to have to affect the timing of some of these routes, but I actually don't see it as being such a high scoring game, Jonathan. I think this could be like 2 teams feeling each other out. I think this has got more the makings of like a 24-21 type game to me. I think it could be, I think both offenses could struggle a little bit. Just big pressure, big atmosphere, big environment tends to lend itself towards the defenses. And so even though these offenses are really good, mostly everybody's looking at this matchup saying like, well, the 2 offenses are going to be great, which makes me think it's going to go the other way because it's college football. So why would it not, Jonathan? Why would it not go the other way,
Right. It's always what you think, and it's the complete opposite. It's funny that you brought up, your key to the game, because I said that this offensive line is going to have to play like the best offensive line in the country, right? I think Georgia's going to come after Quinn Ewers. Like I said, he was not great last week. He was just good enough to beat Oklahoma, which, I mean, they could have put Arch in there. They might have even put the 3rd string quarterback in there. We would have beat Oklahoma. I mean, it was really no problem. But I do think Georgia has the ability, like you said, the health of Michael Williams certainly is going to be a key to that. But I think they have the ability to speed Quinn Ewers up. I think they have the ability to make Quinn Ewers uncomfortable. And, if he's not hitting shots in the passing game, and, Texas can't run the ball, which is a Steve Sarkisian specialty, regardless of who he has quarterback and regardless of who he has at quarterback and wide receiver, then I think Texas is really going to struggle, offensively. And so it's all going to come down to who's the better quarterback in this game. But there are opportunities there. If Jalen Milroe and Kalen DeBoer could do it, if, Michael Van Buren and, Jeff Lebby can do it, then certainly Quinn Ewers and Steve Sarkisian can do it. But that offensive line has to keep him upright, keep him poised, allow him time to pick apart that Georgia defense. And then certainly he can, because like I said, there's so many weapons on this Texas offense, and they're going to get opportunities to take advantage of a Georgia defense that struggled, especially in the secondary. So really the key is the offensive line, right? You know what I mean? Keeping that pass rush away from Quinn Ewers and keeping him comfortable and poised. And so, when I look at this game, I know you said it's going to be probably 21-24 in favor of Georgia. I'm looking at it 34-38. I think it ends similar to the way that the Alabama game did. I think the ball is going to be in Carson Beck's hands with a chance to win the game. I think 105,000 strong, maybe even more in DKR. That Texas defense that's been great all year, they find a way to get a stop on the last drive, and Texas wins one of the games of the year in dramatic fashion. Daniel, your last thoughts on this matchup?
No, I mean, I can't wait to see it. This is why you choose to be, or you're born into being, you're blessed enough to be a fan of one of these 2 schools, right? Like, you get to watch games like this, matchups like this. This may not be the last time that Georgia and Texas play this year. They might play in Atlanta. They might play in the college football playoff. Time will tell. But Georgia fans, big trip to Austin. I know everybody's excited about it, and so I can't wait to watch. It'll be fun either way.
And before we get out of here, the one thing we have not talked about, the reunion of Bevo and Uga. You know what I'm saying?
Oh
Like,
my
hopefully we
gosh,
get a little bit
yeah.
of Bevo and Uga love, because the last time they played, you know,
That's
Uga
true.
was running for his life. So,
That's
you know what I'm saying?
true. The
We'll have
last time they played, Uga almost got stepped on, and Texas was back after that game, as I recall, Jonathan. So I don't know, not sure if you remember that, but they were back after that game.
I remember that. I don't know where we
Yeah.
were back. I don't know back what, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But, you know, it was a long time ago. But Daniel
Yeah.
Monroe from Locked On Bulldogs, Jonathan Davis from Locked On Longhorns signing out, previewing one of the games of the year in the SEC, one of the games of the year in college football. Should be electric on Saturday night in Austin, Texas.